Frank Gardner.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. You've done very well to be here, actually, given there was the gala dinner last night. So, congratulations. We've got a really interesting panel today, and interesting topics. We're going to be talking about the use of intelligence, and really specifically looking at two things: intelligence for counterterrorism, and intelligence for countering state espionage, countries spying on each other. And the panel we've got, I think, is extremely well qualified for this. So starting in the middle with Dame Pauline Neville-Jones, who has had many careers. She's been an ambassador. She's worked in the technology industry. She's been a BBC governor. But most importantly, she's also been security minister in the British government. And she now sits in the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber of the British Parliament. Next to me is the Honourable Michael Chertoff, Secretary Chertoff, who ran Homeland Security in the United States. He's a former judge, but don't hold that against him. And over in the far corner is Hans-Jürgen Schindler, who worked on the UN's Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and ISIS monitoring unit. So probably most people weren't even aware, actually, that the UN has this unit, but that it does incredibly well-resourced research into what the statistics are, what the trends are in the various jihadist groups. I'm going to start straight away with asking Pauline Neville-Jones, what is the difference between intelligence and information? Pauline.
Well, as your question clearly indicates, I mean, there is a real difference. I suppose there are two ways in which the word intelligence can be properly used. It's certainly the case that if an agency gets a piece of information from a covert source, somebody not acknowledged to have an open relationship with them, that could be regarded as a piece of intelligence because it's come that way. But the much more important sense in which the word intelligence is used is it's information that's been assessed. That's to say, it's not something that you pick up and say, oh, well, I've been handed this piece of information, it must be good, and I can rely on it. The key issue is, what is the quality of this piece of information that I've received? And there's a testing system. You assess it against what else you know, what you know about where it came from, the likely reliability, the likely authenticity of it. And in the end, you end up giving it, in effect, a rating. You know, this is I know these guys. They really are, they've proved themselves in the past to be extremely reliable. This is an important piece that you will also look at it from the point of view of its relevance. I think this is something that we really can take seriously. At the other end of the spectrum, there will be something that comes in, unknown source, it doesn't seem to fit the pattern. That doesn't mean to say that because it doesn't fit what you already know that it isn't relevant, because some of the mistakes in the intelligence world, of course, arise when instead of looking at the piece of information, they rely on what they already really think they know.
I want to pick up on what you said about mistakes in just a moment. I should just remind you, by the way, this is going to be a very free-flowing debate. So I'm going to be expecting questions and piercing questions from all of you. You've got the Slido you should have, which is this slido.com. If you go to that and just type in the event code, which is GLOBSEC 2018, and the event space here is the Danube space. So do feel free to send in questions, and Simon next door will be picking them out, and we'll ask them. Michael, if I could turn to you. Pauline there talked about mistakes in intelligence. You were in Washington, although not in charge, obviously, of intelligence at the time, but in September 2001, debatably the worst intelligence failure of our time, the 9/11 attacks. Have the lessons been learned, do you think, since then, in the intervening 17 years?
I mean, I think a number of lessons have been learned. I think when the 9/11 Commission looked back on the failure, it was really the inability to connect the dots, so to speak. In other words, you had pieces of information in different agencies. You had the CIA had some information, FBI had others, but no one had ever integrated it together. Some of it was also a lack of data. Here's an interesting experiment we did after several years later. Taking passenger name record information, which is very plain vanilla data that you generate when you travel by air, like who paid for the ticket, what's your contact number. Had we had that information in 2001 on the hijackers, we would have connected 15 of the 19 hijackers to each other and to known terrorists. So you didn't need to have particularly sophisticated information. You simply needed to be able to bring it together and aggregate it and then communicate it within the community. So I think we've done quite a bit to promote that interaction, but it's far from perfect. And I would say the biggest flaw we still have is when someone encounters a piece of information, they don't understand that it has significance, and therefore they don't enter it into the system, and only in hindsight do you see that it became something that was relevant.
That's one of the most depressing things about it, actually, is that, you know, as the IRA once said back in the 1980s, that you, the government, you've got to be successful every single time. We've only got to be successful once to stop a plot. Now, Andrew Parker, who is the Director General of MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence agency, gave a speech last week in Berlin, very significantly in Berlin, where he said that there have been 12 terrorist attacks stopped in Britain since the March Westminster Bridge attack last year, and 25 since 2013, which is good. But of course, we also had 4 successful terrorist attacks in Britain last year, which has been quite a shock to people. Hans-Jürgen, if I could turn to you. Britain's leaving the European Union, and there are fears that both British and European security will be undermined by this. I'm not just saying this because I'm British, but the Brits are quite good at intelligence and security, but they still make mistakes. Does that pose a threat to European security?
I think there's a really fundamental recognition that whatever Brexit means otherwise, we need to limit what Brexit means in the security area. And that Brexit, and I think one of the reasons why the speech was in Berlin, was a signal that on security and intelligence cooperation, very little will change after Brexit. And it has to be like this. You cannot just have an island off the coast of Europe.
But Britain's withdrawing from Europol. They're not allowed to be part of Europol anymore.
Yes, but that doesn't mean they're not allowed to share and cooperate with Europol, right? So withdrawing from Europol doesn't mean you cannot cooperate with Europol. It just means you're no longer involved in the structural decision-making of what the organization does. Europol is always open to cooperation internationally. They cooperated with us in the Security Council. So they are very much adept to multilateral work. So I would hope that in the final negotiations, and we're not even at that point yet, rules will be worked out on how the intelligence cooperations is going to proceed in practical terms after Brexit. But I think there is a political will and recognition on both sides, the European as well as the British side, that this would be a spectacularly bad idea to include this area in a full Brexit.
Good. And interesting, actually, I went to Brussels in October to speak to the EU Security Commissioner, who said something very similar, that counterterrorism is just so important, particularly given the attacks that we've had in Europe, in Nice, in Stockholm, in Barcelona, and Berlin, that it's going to be ring-fenced. I hope that's true. My personal view, for what it's worth, is that counterterrorism should never be politicized. It should never be used as a sort of, well, if you don't do this, then we're going to withhold our cooperation. Counterterrorism saves lives. It should always be above and beyond politics. That's my personal view, and I'm just throwing it out there. Pauline, going back to the business of mistakes, I mean, 9/11 obviously was an intelligence failing, but there was something almost more worrying in a way. In 2003, Britain and the US invaded Iraq on the basis of what turned out to be false intelligence. It wasn't lies, it was just badly assessed. And just to explain what happened there, there was such enormous political pressure on MI6, Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, the overseas intelligence gathering arm of the British government, that there was such enormous pressure on them to follow the United States into Iraq that too much weight was given to really poorly assessed intelligence, which actually turned out not to be intelligence at all. Since then, we're told that there has been a complete root and branch revamping, restructuring, so that agent runners there is a clear Chinese war between agent runners and the people that they report to. So the reports people will assess that intelligence. If they don't think it's well enough sourced, they'll send it back, say, no, we want another source, or ask your agent about this and that. Pauline, from your experience being security minister, where you would have been inside very much the intelligence circle, do you think that, is there enough clear water now between one side and the other of intelligence? Is intelligence properly assessed so that when it goes up to Whitehall, to Cabinet, to the National Security Council in the UK, that a mistake like that could never happen again?
Well, I think all political systems are fallible, and so I wouldn't ever want to say, and I wouldn't have wanted to say, before that happened, that it couldn't. And so I wouldn't want to say it couldn't happen again. Do I think it's likely? No. I think that was a lesson very, very, very deeply taken, as you will be aware, the audience are not, that we've had a very big inquest on the whole question of the participation in the Iraq War, which has covered all the aspects of it, taken many years to achieve under the chairmanship of somebody called John Chilcot. You can't really ignore, when you get conclusions of a kind which criticise the political layer, the workings of the bureaucracy, the manner of decision making, those are not things in an honest democracy that you can just simply cast aside. I do think there is a real separation. There was a change in the constitutional relationship between the services and the government, in that one of the non-elected special advisors of the Prime Minister of the day was put in line management of bureaucrats, which is something our system does not permit, and it hasn't happened since. That created a degree of pressure in the system between the political and the bureaucratic, which is absent if you don't allow that kind of relationship to be in being. So, answer to your question, yes, I think we're in a much better place. I don't think that precludes still making mistakes, though the kind of mistake that happened there, which was a combination of political pressure, and I have to say also, I do think failings in the assessment process, an unwillingness to believe that the situation might have changed from the last time that the Western agencies had really serious direct contact inside the country, and they had preserved, rather fossilized a picture of what it was like when they still had good intelligence, right through a period when the sources available were very poor, and took that as base case and assessed everything against that. And it was that key element that was wrong.
Right.
But I would say this, in general, I think one of the things that people need to understand, and this is really more on the decision makers, a lot of it has to do with what the burden of proof is and what the risk is. So, let's assume something's 50-50. If there's a 50-50 chance it's going to rain tomorrow, not a big deal. If it's a 50-50 chance someone has a nuclear bomb they're going to detonate in a city tomorrow, you're going to pitch the burden of proof differently. And I think one of the issues, and I wasn't involved in this, but just from maybe somewhat proximate to it, is that the recognition that if there were a weapon of mass destruction, it would be devastating, meant that there was a tendency to lower the threshold for taking action. And I think it was compounded by another feature, which I can draw on, if I can draw on my having been a prosecutor and a lawyer. But when someone acts in a way that's guilty, that tends to increase the weight in favor of saying that he is guilty. And the example I used to use is if somebody was a convicted murderer and they got out of prison and they were walking down the street and a police officer saw them and the person had his hand in his pocket like this, looking like they had a gun, but you couldn't see a gun, and the police officer said, "Stop and raise your hands," and the person kept advancing, and the policeman shot him, that would generally be considered to be a justifiable self-defense. So in fairness to the intelligence community, sometimes these issues boil down to not a mistaken assessment, but a judgment about how much proof you need to take action.
Right. Which brings me on to Iran. Hans-Jürgen, you worked in Iran for your government, for the German government, for 6 years, from 2005 to 2011. How good do you think is Western intelligence now on Iran's nuclear ambitions? And I mean, obviously, the International Atomic Energy Agency has got inspectors that's going in, and Iran is still subject to very rigorous, regular inspections. They've cooperated fully with the terms of the JCPOA, the joint, I don't remember what the C stands for, anyhow, the Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. But now that the US has withdrawn from it unilaterally, there are fears that they could start producing some kind of covert weapon. Would they be able to do that without Western intelligence knowing?
I think on this particular subject, Western intelligence was always quite good. But what the JCPOA enabled was a open control of the program with very firm commitments on the Iranian side built into the agreement. It was no longer up to the Iranians. As a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, any state, of course, has to allow inspections. But it is, unless you ratify the additional protocol, which is planned for transition day of the JCPOA. So at the end of the JCPOA, the Iranians are obligated to ratify the additional protocol. If you haven't done this, and Iran hasn't done this at this point, inspections have to be notified and agreed to by Iran. Obviously, that is not a very effective inspection regime. And then you solely rely on intelligence to assess the nuclear program. I think we've been very good, and I think, if anything, Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation showed how good intelligence was in the past on this one. But what the JCPOA does is it obligates Iran to allow snap inspections, to allow cameras, to allow SEALs in its country on its program, and therefore creates another layer in addition to intelligence, where very good specialists who do this all around the world can assess what's going on and will pick up if there's anything else that is going on. Without the JCPOA, this is going to be, again, going back to the intelligence picture, and as with terrorism, there is never a full guarantee that you're going to pick up everything that's going on any given issue.
Can I remind people, we're starting to get questions coming in. Do send us your questions on the Slido. We absolutely welcome this being a kind of participation thing. So do crack on with those. This is really a question for both Michael and Hans-Jürgen. The US and Germany have very different ideas when it comes to surveillance, and yet you're partners and allies in intelligence sharing. You have a common enemy in terrorism. US has helped Germany with investigations and vice versa. How do you square that circle when it comes to surveillance? Because we know from the Edward Snowden revelations the extraordinary lengths that the NSA and Britain's GCHQ go to look at people's private emails and communications. In Germany, of course, partly because Frau Merkel has her own views on it, having been a citizen of the DDR, East Germany, she's not very keen on surveillance. How do you? I mean, let me ask you first, Hans-Jürgen. How do you cope with that big difference in opinion?
Yeah, it's not just Angela Merkel. I mean, I'm sorry to become a little bit historical here. What you need to take into account is that German society experienced twice in variants, fascist and communist, what over-surveillance means for your personal freedoms, individually in the country.
Could you give us an example of what it was like under the Stasi in East Germany?
Well, I'm not from East Germany, so I'm not the most qualified person. But I do remember having a professional look in my German government capacity on what happened there and what we can learn from the lessons. And there is a very famous case in the Stasi Museum where they opened a file, blackened out all the names, and the file was started because a young woman was dancing at a wedding with someone from West Germany, and that triggered a 2.5-year investigation into the woman's background, including drawings then when she was married and had kids of her kids' room. It was an obsessive collection of anything related to these individuals, which, you know, to a certain extent also drowned then the security services, and they were analyzing 1987 data when in 1989 happened. So surely they would have prevented the revolution if they had you know, the time to actually analyze the data from that year. So it was in a spectacular manner intrusive and triggered by absolutely nothing. One dance at one wedding triggers a 2.5-year investigation where your entire private and workspace is documented, and interviews after interviews with your colleagues, friends and family members, you know, attesting whether you are a West German spy or have contacts to West Germany. So it was a very horrible experience, that there was really no trigger point that was low enough for you to be completely mapped out by your own government for whatever purpose. So that, of course, explains the aversion not just of Angela Merkel, but of German society against too much surveillance. However, what really has changed in the last couple of years is with the rise of the Islamic State and the till now really difficulty in mapping out a profile of who would be a potential terrorist, because if you look at the profiles of the foreign terrorist fighters that we know, very little patterns actually emerge. It's not age, it's not occupation, it's not married, not unmarried. It really is difficult. And so there is a recognition that there needs to be a little bit more data collection by the German security agencies.
Michael, let me ask you a very blunt question. Is Germany too soft on surveillance?
Well, I understand the historical concerns, and I'm not an expert in German law. I mean, the U.S. also, contrary to what the impression you get from Snowden, actually does have restraints on surveillance. And one of the constraints, by the way, is exactly what was pointed out, which is if you waste a lot of time chasing nonsense, you don't have the time to look at the things you need to focus on. I break surveillance into two categories. We are generally a low threshold for collection of what we call metadata. That's who made a call, where it went to, and the duration of the call. It's pretty much the same kind of material that your phone company gets with billing records. The value of that is exactly that it allows you to draw connections and see who is connected to somebody that you know is a problem, and then you have a red flag to go look a little bit further. But it's not particularly intrusive. Now, in order to collect content in the United States or on Americans, you do need to get a warrant. We don't have that requirement, for non-Americans overseas because our Constitution doesn't protect the whole world. But even there, I think there's a constraint based on exactly what we talked about. It's a waste of time to chase nonsense. But when you do find somebody that has a terrorist connection, then the ability to collect is maybe the most valuable tool you have in identifying who may be a threat.
We're starting to get questions coming in. By the way, feel free to do it the old-fashioned way and just put your hand up and I'll try and notice you. I mean, not everybody's a fan of the Slido, but we are getting questions coming in, and one of them actually, Michael, is for you. In the world of intelligence analysis, how do you distinguish between speculation and an informed analysis?
Well, I mean, I think that is the essence of what trained analysts are educated to do, which is to understand that you have a given piece of data or a given fact. Now, you can speculate wildly about what that means, but if you have the training, the discipline, you understand, you want to ask, as was said earlier, what is the nature of the source? What is the source's track record? What corroboration is there? How does it fit with other pieces? And does this make sense? And when you put it through a system of having some rigorous analysis, then you can weigh whether it's merely a tantalizing tidbit or actually indicative of something significant?
Pauline, let me ask you another question that's come in here. Which poses the greater threat overall, terrorism or hostile governments?
Whoa.
Because it depends who you are. I mean,
yes. I mean, we've got both, haven't we?
well, it depends who we is, I suppose. If I know, okay, let's say for a NATO country, which poses the greater threat, terrorism or a hostile state?
I found that quite difficult to answer. I mean, potentially the hostile state. I mean, in the end, it all depends on how good your defences are, how good your deterrence mechanisms are, how well you've actually prepared for the world you're in. So I would say at the moment that we have made very great progress on our ability to prevent, and also our ability after a terrorist incident actually still to get those who perpetrated the act. That doesn't mean to say there isn't still a great threat, but it isn't one that actually threatens the whole of society. It certainly causes damage. State threats can be much more directed at the living organism of a society and be much more damaging, even in short term and certainly long term. So I think what we now face, of course, is the rising threat of the state. The state is back on the scene. And so we've got a double challenge.
Let me just throw in a small anecdote. There, a few years ago, I went to a talk given by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor, I think, under President Carter.
Correct. Yes.
And he said, you know, Al-Qaeda, they're mean, they're nasty, because they were the kind of terrorist group du jour at the time, 10 years ago. And he said, but let me put this in context. When I had to go in and wake up the president at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, we might possibly be having an incoming strike, he said, we realized we were looking at 3 to 5 million Americans who would be killed in that first strike. That, he said, that's a real threat. This Al-Qaeda stuff, it's small by comparison. Now, that's not in any way to undermine the horror of what happened on 9/11 and every single terrorist attack since. If you are personally caught up in it, and I speak from experience, it's a bad day. But when David Cameron, our former British Prime Minister, said 2 years ago that ISIS represents an existential threat to our society, he was talking nonsense. They would love to be an existential threat, but they're not. They're not going to raise the black flags of ISIS above Parliament or Buckingham Palace or Timbuktu. Well, they could probably have in Timbuktu, but you get my point. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, whether they're fired by North Korea or somebody else, that represents an existential threat. So it's always worth looking at the spectrum and think, right, what is the worst case scenario? And the worst case scenario is a nuclear exchange with Russia, or any other power for that matter. But Russia is the only one with enough warheads to absolutely wipe out our societies. It's just worth bearing that in mind. So we've got another very good, actually before I come to the slide, you've got a question. Could we have a microphone over here, please? Thanks. And if you could just introduce yourself and your organization, that would be great.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for moderating such an interesting session, and thanks also, therefore, to the panelists. Robin Shepherd, Senior Advisor to the Halifax International Security Forum. A question directed to Pauline Neville-Jones, but also to Michael and Hans in a broader sense. And this is the question, and it's quite a specific question, but with broader implications. And this is something about the so-called 5 Eyes. Which is an intelligence architecture comprising the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And it's always struck me, why only 5? If it's such a good idea, the German colleague on this panel can speak English just as well as our Australian and our Canadian friends. Could you speak to the significance of 5 Eyes? Why, if it is such a good idea, it isn't wider? And then more generally, the question of how we can actually improve our intelligence architecture by global cooperation. Thanks.
Well, 5 Eyes springs out of wartime cooperation. It goes back to, to actually the wartime period. The core of it was the relationship between the UK and the US. And in the post-war period, under the intelligence sharing machinery, which was developed by the US and the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, 5 Anglophone countries, were invited to join. And that is actually, this cooperation is built into the structure of, certainly in the UK, the way in which meetings of the Joint Intelligence Committee, for instance, are actually conducted. So it has long, deep roots which spring out of history and trust. And trust is very, very important in the intelligence world. Are you confident about the democratic structures, the honesty of the system, the reliability of the relationship between bureaucracy, agencies, the rest of government, and the ministerial cadre? So you can see why countries that identify themselves as having the same systems and belonging to the same patterns of government and having the same values would find it easy to cooperate. Now, you raise a very good question, because the nature of the threats that we face these days and the way in which we have to deal with them and the risks we're prepared to take, and there's a difference between threat and risk, does mean that actually we need wider cooperation. And the truth of the matter is that the Five Eyes have extended their relationships. And so there is a good relationship between members of the Five Eyes and the agencies of other democracies, which are really important in this battle. So I think it's less exclusive. It does remain, however, a very good working core where thinking on how you deal with threats to democracies of a really broad kind does take place. And so I wouldn't want to see it dismantled in favor of just equal or ordinary cooperation all around the place. What I do see is the value of bringing others in and sharing both the information you get out of it and also the assessment and the methodologies.
We are getting some really good questions coming in here. So I'm going to have to ask everybody to keep both their questions and the panel to keep their answers reasonably short. Ed Lucas, who, by the way, has written a really good book on cyber threats. There you go. Check in the post, I hope.
Thanks so much. And Frank's books are very good as well.
It's a mutual love-in. I'm sorry.
I think you're absolutely right that the sort of high threat from states is the nuclear proliferation one, and obviously we continue to look at that
hybrid
very closely. But it seems that the really new thing is the states are back waging a kind of this, I hate the word hybrid, sort of new kind of warfare enabled by the internet.
Ed, sorry, could you just explain to the audience what is understood by hybrid warfare?
So hybrid is the combination of all sorts of different tools, the cyber attacks, information attacks, the abuse of the legal system, all the kinetic stuff ranging from targeted assassinations and intimidation right up to invasion with irregular warfare of the kind we saw in Crimea. So it's a very big toolbox. I think I wrote a piece called The Toxic 20, which listed 20 tactics, and I was immediately told I'd left out another 15. So it's a very wide range of things that a state like Russia particularly, but also China, could do. And it raises the difficulty of the intelligence services that a lot of this stuff has an intelligence component, but it goes way beyond the traditional remit of the intelligence services. So what do you do if you see there is an information operation that's going on that's attacking your media, there's something going on in your education system, there is abuse of your criminal justice system going on, all these different things where it's quite hard for an intelligence service to go and intervene directly, and the danger is that we end up...
Ed, sorry, I'm going to move you on. Did you have a
so my question is, how do intelligence services deal with this? How do we deal with the Putinist attack without Putinizing our own system, mirroring the way their system runs?
Michael?
Well, first of all, I would be careful describing all of those things as hybrid warfare. If you use the word warfare too much, then you blur when you actually have real war. Now, to me, hybrid warfare involves, for example, people masquerading as not being soldiers who are actually conducting military operations like you get in Ukraine. Information operations, abuse of the legal system, what they call lawfare, are problematic, but I wouldn't quite categorize them as warfare. What I would say is we've got to broaden our concept of intelligence, because much of the kind of tactics that we're talking about in this latter category are open source. They don't require spies and satellites. What you need is to have the ability to marshal information from a wide variety of different sources to see what's happening. And then, and this is not an intelligence problem, the question is, what is the appropriate response? And I think that's where we're struggling now to understand how to do enough to respond, but not overdo. Because if you overdo, you're actually doing your adversary's work for him or her.
We've got a really good question here. Well, they're all good questions. Somebody has asked, in lone wolf terrorist attacks, in other words, where it's just one person who appears to be operating on their own without any kind of support network, in lone wolf terrorist attacks, the perpetrator, i.e. the criminal, the terrorist, is often already under surveillance. Any concrete steps towards putting the intel to good use and saving lives? Hans?
Well, first of all, let's look at the term lone wolf, right? So the way the question frames that is the case that everyone has in mind. It's a dude or a gal sitting in front of their computer deciding that they need to kill someone now. I think the majority of cases that were reported as lone wolf cases around the world in the last couple of years turned out that the lone wolf wasn't quite as lone, as one of the panelists said yesterday. There is always a network and a connection. The cases where auto-radicalization happens completely disconnected from anyone else are countable on one hand worldwide. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that obviously there is a difference between someone who has weird ideas, someone who has weird ideas who may be dangerous, and someone who has weird ideas and is going to do something. So there's always going to be a much larger portion of people that are going to be recognized by the security services as such. But you cannot go around and arrest. We have what's the category of Gefährder in Deutschland, which are people who have weird ideas who potentially could do a terrorist attack. Nationally, that's about 8,000 people. That's just one of the crude numbers here. You cannot go around arrest 8,000 people on the suspicion that they may be doing something. We're still a nation based on law where you have to actually commit a crime before you get arrested. So there will always be these failures where the intelligence agency is going to miss that this guy is going from weird ideas into operational mode. Simply because also the terrorist tactics have become very simplistic. So it's no longer the 9/11 year-long preparation with flying lessons and all that is connected with that. It's taking a knife and going down in the main street and knifing someone down, or as very painfully in Berlin demonstrated, you steal a truck, you can kill very efficiently in a very short amount of time a lot of people just simply on a Christmas market. So there is always this risk that simply we have to live with. And here where I see the terrorist threat as being a threat also to the core of liberal democracy is that it could drive governments in liberal democracies to introduce, in order to satisfy the need for more security, ever more intrusive measures, and therefore slowly undermine what a liberal democracy is all about. That's where I see the longer-term danger of the current terrorist situation.
Could I just echo something, because I think this is really important. And again, it has to do with not overreacting, because some of what we've seen, at least in the US, in the most recent examples of what are sometimes called terrorist attacks, are people motivated not by jihadi ideology, but by extreme political ideologies. And there was a story in the paper or in the news in the last day or so that the Las Vegas shooter, who I think killed more people than any other shooter we've had in the US, shortly before he carried out his activities, was out railing anti-government, and the government's going to take our guns away and we have to do something about it. So we are slipping into a time when individuals who are disturbed or in some way are going to start to commit violent acts, and we have to be careful not to assimilate that into terrorism, or we start to make police problems into national security problems.
It's a very, very good point, and thank you, Samuel, for that question. There's another question here on how is the intelligence community dealing today with the returnees? In other words, people who've gone out to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS and decided they've had enough of it or they want to come back. How do they deal with that? And I'm going to ask Dame Pauline this one. Let me phrase this in a slightly different way. Do you think the intelligence services are on top of the problem? Do they really know who the returnees are and what to do with them?
Well, I have to say two things about that. I mean, one is what do the intelligence services know, and then what do you do about it? And frankly, what you do about it is actually not the intelligence services. How much do we know? Well, I haven't been in the in this milieu for some time, so I'm be careful about what I say. A lot depends when it comes to returnees of how good your links are with your intelligence partners. I mean, take Syria, for example. We're quite dependent on our relationship with the Turks and the Turkish services, and also our own resources. We have got better at tracking the movement of people. There are many ways, however, across land into the United Kingdom. So you can't be certain that you will always pick up whoever it is. But the policy is, if you do manage to pick them up at the border, then people will be put through a process which determines who they are, what they've, and how much we know about what they've done. And if terrorism is an offence in the UK, wherever it's committed, so if you're in that category, you are going to face the law. And most returnees have been involved in some way. So then it's a question of what the what your social and political approach is to return terrorists or to return persons from an area of conflict, and it will be a very individual judgment. But by and large, those who've been involved, if they do come back to the United Kingdom, can expect to face the law and a very long sentence. Okay. Which means that many don't come back. And one of the reasons why we have dispersed terrorists going elsewhere, of course, is that they know perfectly well that they cannot safely go back to the country from which they came.
Hans.
Looking at my viewpoint from my time at the Security Council dealing with the issue of foreign terrorist fighters and returnees, we are at a much better place than we were in 2002 when people left the camps in Afghanistan. In that, triggered in part also by Resolution 2178, the famous FTF, Foreign Terrorist Fighter Resolution of the Security Council, member states have collected identities. So we do have a quite extensive global list among member states.
But they're not biometric though, are they? Those identities?
Well, partially biometric, right? So the FTF database within Interpol, where states are encouraged to deliver their data to for global exchange, does include a surprising amount of pictures, because they used to be citizens in this country. So there is an ID card, there is a passport that was issued to these people at one point or the other. So the biometric opportunity is there, the identities are there. It's now, however, a question of how widely are you allowing and willing to share that with other member states? Because exactly like Baroness Neville-Jones said, it's a question of you cannot predict the route that these guys are going to take. And therefore you need to share as widely as possible.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions at the same time, one after the other, and then we're going to introduce a short poll, which is not a small man from Warsaw, but actually 5 questions we're going to put to you. So you have a question, sir.
Yes, Julian Lindley-French.
Nice to see you again, Julian.
Yeah, likewise, Frank. There's an innate tension in this debate, which is you rightly seem to be suggesting that the nature of the threat array suggests more offensive and more intrusive intelligence. At a time when legal frameworks for data collection, data gathering, and privacy are themselves being strengthened. My question is this: given that tension, what reforms to intelligence structures, methods, and tradecraft would you suggest so that you can maintain both the operational effectiveness and indeed the legal frameworks in which you operate?
Okay, that will be one for Michael, I think. And there was a question over here. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Ian Anthony from SIPRI in Stockholm. It actually follows on, I think, from that. It relates to an issue which has been discussed extensively, and it goes back to the point that was raised about how to differentiate between people who need help and people who need to be controlled. One of the discussions has been whether it would be feasible and desirable to incorporate into a systematic framework information from, for example, public health, social services, education systems, and also even civil society, non-governmental organizations. Now that's been discussed backwards and forwards, but I'd just be interested in your perspectives where we are with that discussion. Is it desirable? Is it feasible? Is it happening?
Pauline, one for you, I think. Michael, do you want to go first?
Sure. So first of all, I actually think that, at least speaking from the United States standpoint, our current rules governing the ability to collect data are sufficient. Although there have been some tweaks to it, we have fairly broad authority to collect metadata, which I think is not particularly intrusive, and then you do require a higher threshold to get into content. But to bring in the second question, I think it's very true that one thing that happens sometimes is the intelligence community becomes enthralled with what you can get using technology or using spies, and what's open source or available from other means is somehow devalued because you didn't have to use tradecraft to get it. And in many cases, open source and what's available from other means is quite important. So I do think we need to find a way to also incorporate things that come from the social services side, social media. But I'd add one additional thing. If you're going to get cooperation from people in reporting that there's somebody who's a threat, and it may be a family member or a close friend, you've got to come up with a way of responding that is not limited to the criminal justice system. Because a lot of people will hesitate to turn their son in if they think their son is going to go to jail. And so we need structures for people who have not yet committed a violent act to kind of divert them and maybe de-radicalize them or get them some treatment, and maybe a little coercive. Maybe they have to be under supervision, but to take it out of the criminal justice model and put it into a more therapeutic model.
Pauline, I mean, just before you answer this gentleman's question, I mean, perhaps you could just tell the audience about the Channel program that the UK has.
Well, yes, this gets us into both prevention and remediation, because it can happen at either end. I mean, one of the things I think, one of the big challenges that remains, and this is where actually it partly answered Julian French's question, is that I think the area where we still have the greatest handicaps and the greatest problems are in actually how you go about trying to create circumstances in which people are not tempted to go for terrorism, one, which is essentially a social and political problem, and it's a problem of integration and attitudes and people actually wanting to live in the society they're in. And secondly, it's a question of what kind of measures, therefore, you have to actively put in place and how you get assent for those. Because it does mean, actually, altering policy. I think I think we still have a long way to go. The UK has probably done, I think it's fair to say, probably more work on that than most other countries. We've had the problem of terrorism longer, and I think we did tackle the whole social side of it sooner. How much success have we had? It's very hard to tell because you simply don't know. I mean, in the intelligence world, you can know when you stop a conspiracy. You've got evidence that you did actually stop it. When it comes to how many people did you persuade not to go down a road they might otherwise have done, it's a wholly negative quantity. So we can't know. The only way you can assess it is, over time by the number of successful activities that there are. When we go wider into the whole question of how many people need health, there is a great focus at the moment in the UK on the whole question of mental health. And it has much broader roots than simply the problem of misfits in society. It has to do with stress and with the, I think, the notion of how you have to achieve in society, and it's affecting children. So I think we will move towards greater focus on the extent to which some of these episodes are actually caused by people who are ill rather than ill motivated. But I think it's very, very difficult territory, and I think we have to go in a sense on what they did rather than why they did it when it comes to actually controlling the situation.
Thanks. Just to put the previous point in context, for the last 15 years, Britain has had a counter-terrorism policy called Contest, and it's rests on the various P's. Prepare, which is how do you prepare somewhere for a terrorist attack? In other words, putting up barriers, for example, outside the House of Parliament to stop somebody trying to crash a truck bomb into
protect.
it. Protect, yes, sorry. Protect, prepare, pursue, which is, you know,
Obvious.
police action. The hardest one of all has been prevent. Preventing more people getting drawn into the pipeline of terrorism. And I think the UK government has been largely successful on all the other ones. Prevent is a pretty mixed record. It's very sensitive because there are plenty of people in Muslim communities in Britain who feel that they are being unfairly targeted, especially when a very large number of the tip-offs that are given to the police and MI5, the intelligence agencies, have come from Muslim communities saying, we're pretty worried about so-and-so. He's stopped coming to the mainstream prayers. He's keeping to himself. He's becoming more and more extreme in his ideas. So there are referrals, and people do get taken away just in time from going down a very dangerous path. But at the same time, you've got tremendous radicalization happening in the prisons all over Europe. France has a massive problem with this, but that's another thing. We're going to broaden it out a little bit now, beyond just counterterrorism and state threats, to bring you this poll that's here. Well, the poll question is ours, but the answers are yours. What do you think are the greatest challenges for Europe? Is it migration? Is it terrorism? Is it Russia? Is it cyber attack? Or is it President Trump? I don't know who put that last one in. So the results are dynamic, so please vote now. That, at the moment, that's interesting. Okay, they're moving around all over the place, but at the moment, migration is just in the lead. Now, just to be clear on this, that's not to say that a person who is a migrant or a refugee is a threat. The idea behind that question is, what is the threat to society or to the nation from too much migration? And just to put this in context, when I lived in Cairo the first time in Egypt, there were roughly 40 million Egyptians. Today there are nearly 100 million. Now, Egypt is a country in lockdown. It's had the Tahrir Square, Arab Spring protests. Briefly, it had a democratically elected government, which went wrong. Then it was overthrown by the military, and today the country is in lockdown. What would happen if the trickle of migrants that were coming across the Mediterranean in desperate straits, what would happen if that was joined by tens of millions of Egyptians? I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that is a factor that some people perhaps haven't considered so far. So, I don't know if we're still getting these results coming in, but we are indeed. Okay, so far 42% migration. Interesting that you see terrorism lower than Donald Trump. I mean, I can remember taking a camera to Yemen and interviewing somebody up in a mountain village, and I said, what do you think of Osama bin Laden? Bin Laden, good man. Bush, he's terrorist. You know, and that's just the way people think sometimes. Coming to Donald Trump, and I'm going to aim this one at Michael as the sole American on the panel. Do you think the world is a more dangerous place because of the unpredictability of the current US administration?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer because, first of all, in some respects, the administration has not been, as a whole, the actions have not been that unpredictable. I mean, many of the things you're seeing now are adjustments or continuations of trends that have been out there for a long period of time. I think, you know, the President Trump's tweeting habits inject an element of confusion into kind of judging what American policy is, but it doesn't necessarily translate directly into American action. And I would also say, in general, part of what adds to the air of unpredictability is the amount of media frenzy over almost every little thing that happens, so that people wind up being literally inundated with information that's not really informative, it's really speculative, to use a term we used earlier. So I think we have to wait and see. I do think the key issue will be, it's not so much a problem when you disrupt conventional wisdom. That can be useful. The thing is, disruption has to be part of a strategy. You have to have a follow-on strategy. And what we've yet to see is whether the disruptive things we've experienced in the last year have a follow-on strategy, or whether all you have is disruption, and then it becomes very difficult to figure out how to deal with problems.
I was brought up in a world where one of the cardinal principles of operation was allies are allies, are allies. And it took a very great deal to persuade you that it was right in a given circumstance, to differ from your allies. President Trump does not seem to value allies or alliances, and I think that's terribly undermining. So I'm afraid I do think it's, I think where the Western world is in a weaker place, less able to talk to itself, less able to uphold what it stands for, when it's not actually working internally. I think it's, and this goes on for a long time. You begin to have damage to the alliance, which then has long-term consequences.
This is actually very relevant to the poll that we've just done, because let's not forget we are here right in the heart of Central Europe, a country that was formerly part of the Warsaw Pact when it was Czechoslovakia. And the poll, if we can just bring it up, shows that a close second to the perceived threat from mass migration is Russia, up there at 33%, due presumably to its actions in Crimea and elsewhere. We've also got, if we can just go back to the questions here, very interesting question come in from somebody, but I can't read it. There we go. I have to read it. Okay. How much is cooperation of the intelligence services influenced by politics? Do Trump or Brexit negotiations influence the day-to-day work of mid-level intelligence officers? I don't know which one of you three wants to answer that. You choose. Who wants to go with that one?
I don't think I know the answer to that question.
Right.
My suspicion is that actually at the moment, operationally, it's okay. What I do think is, over time, all these things erode if you start getting real divergence at the top. So you can't expect close cooperation if up at the top it's not being sustained.
I mean, my experience, because by comparison now it seems trivial, but President Bush was quite unpopular in Europe, and there were real conflicts between, let's say, the U.S. and France during my time in office in terms of political issues and policy issues, and yet we had very good operational cooperation and intelligence. I didn't see any problem with that. So I actually tend to believe that, notwithstanding political differences, the professionals continue to work together, with one exception. If you start to get a phenomenon in which political leaders are beginning to expose classified information or things that are very sensitive for political reasons and put them out there, then you do wind up with a negative effect on sharing, because that...
And that has happened. That happened in the case of Manchester.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate there, Pauline?
Well, I don't remember the detail, but President Trump actually put out into the public domain some information that we already had in our possession about what had happened before it was the police who were, after all, it's the police who have to take over, when you have an incident, before they were actually ready to reveal that, and it damaged their ability to operate.
It was after a bomb killed 22 people, including children, in Manchester at a concert, an Ariana Grande concert last year.
But political differences can, from my professional experience, can make it more difficult to cooperate. I remember when the German government decided not to join the coalition to attack Iraq in 2003, there was a real dip on Iraq in intelligence cooperation from the American side as an answer to us not taking part in this. Argument was, if you're not part of it, you don't need to know it. So there can be a disruption. But there's also, luckily, and I'm sorry that I come back to the counterterrorism issue, a greater recognition that there needs to be a globally better and more integrated intelligence cooperation because of that threat. And GLOBSEC here does, under the leadership of Secretary Chertoff, work on establishing a center of excellence for intelligence, transatlantic, in order to make sure that this intelligence cooperation is continuing and to improve and get smoother by building a network of trust between European and North American services.
Question over here. If you can just say who you are first.
Hello, Jakub Rafaj from GLOBSEC Policy Institute. I'd like to touch upon a subject that is rather controversial, but nevertheless directly related to the name of the panel, topic. It has been recently estimated that private intelligence agencies hired by the US government, especially after the 9/11, produce over 60,000 intelligence reports annually. Most of them draw on the same open source intelligence, the same sources, recirculating the same sources, potentially overshadowing more granular but more actionable intelligence. Don't you feel that in a way we lower our intelligence capabilities, we sacrifice it in favor of the more financially expedient option, that is by outsourcing our intelligence? Thank you.
Michael, do you want to take that
I
one?
have to say I'm not aware of any massive outsourcing of intelligence by the U.S. intelligence community. I mean, obviously there's open source data which people use, you know, rightly, but at least in my experience, I don't remember any significant outsourcing of the responsibility to collect to private companies.
I mean, so Hans-Jörg, I mean, when you were in the UN monitoring thing, did you outsource intelligence gathering at all?
I mean, obviously for open source intelligence,
but did you commission reports
has a
coming from
limited
outside?
size. We can't do everything, but I mean, obviously we have the mandate as a team, or when I was there, I had the mandate to cooperate with intelligence services, so that was number one. But looking at the current terror problem and the role that the internet and social media plays for ISIS, it's impossible not to look at it, but it's also quite a large manpower required to do that. So yes, we did use professional providers of open source intelligence, in particular as far as the internet and social media is concerned. And I don't really see anything wrong with that, because if you put it out in the open on the internet, you got to consider the fact that it's going to be analyzed. State-run intelligence agencies do far more intrusive things like that, and that I don't know of any nation who has outsourced that to the private sector.
No, I agree with that. I mean, precisely. I do think that open source information, though, is useful, but as an addition to, rather than a substitute for. And we could well use it. I mean, I think that a great deal of valuable work, you know, which does make links, does discover consequences, all of those things. I think, you know, that government can use that very usefully and should seek to do so. But I don't think it's a substitute for the core intelligence work that goes on. And I have no indication that, you know, there's been any kind of trade-off of that kind.
Okay, we've got, I'll take one more from the Slido, and then we'll take some more questions, and I think we've got about 15 minutes to go. So this is a really topical one. What can we expect from the future CIA activities with Ms. Gina Haspel as the head of the organization, given her controversial history? So Gina Haspel was running a black site, a CIA black site in Thailand, immediately after the 9/11 attacks and the so-called war on terror was begun. And at that black site, which has been called by the media a torture site, enhanced interrogation methods such as waterboarding were used. So it's made her appointment very controversial. She has said that today she wouldn't have authorized such things or something to that effect. She didn't approve of it, but she refused to condemn it at the time. So organizations that campaign against torture are very, very upset that somebody who is so associated with that program should be put in charge of the world's largest intelligence gathering organization. I'm afraid, Michael, this one comes back to you. What can we expect from future CIA activities with her at the helm?
So I don't know her personally, but I know people who know her and think very highly of her. And I think actually people should be pleased with this appointment, because you have a person who is a career professional in the intelligence community, not a political figure. And in the past, the most controversial CIA directors have been people who came from politics. So it's good to have a professional in charge. I don't think there's going to be enhanced interrogation again. And frankly, I think everybody in the intelligence community who went through that entire period, which was characterized by the following phenomenon. Political leaders would say, do whatever you have to do to stop another attack. And then after a couple of years, when there wasn't another attack, the political people would say, you did that? Oh my God. So there's I would say that burned the people in the intelligence community a little bit, with the sense that they were the victims of bait and switch. And the consequence of that, from people I know in the community, is they are probably more cautious than anybody else in carrying out an instruction that they think will later turn out to be the subject of a revisitation. So I would imagine she'll conduct herself very professionally. I think she's well regarded within the agency, and I think it's an appointment that should be reassuring rather than disturbing.
She may have a harder time, establishing her credibility because of this background. That's the only comment I think she'll be very careful on the subject of torture.
Yeah, but I don't think within the agency she's going to have any problem.
No, I'm talking about Congress. And the wider world.
But it does highlight one really important point that I always make in conversations, is that intelligence services are an instrument. And it is really important to build rules and limitations around that instrument, because just because an intelligence service serves a liberal democracy doesn't automatically shield it from doing things. So you need to give political guidance on how far they're supposed to go, because from personal experience I can tell you, you will always go 100% of the legal opportunities that you have, because if you don't and things happen, you're the one who's going to get blamed. So it is an instrument that needs guidance and that needs rules built around that. And it's a political and a discussion within society what those rules and boundaries should supposed to be, but you always have to expect it to be used 100%. Not 99%, not common sense, but 100% of the leverage you give an intelligence agency.
I think there's inevitably an element of doubt or of hesitation that some countries might hesitate to give information to the CIA if they think it's going to end up in some way in an abuse of an individual, possibly, potentially. But let's go with Michael's interpretation. There's a question here.
Yeah, my name is Gert Dundal from NATO. You started out with a drawing both on CT and nations spying on each other from the beginning. One kind of base. Intelligence is inherently national business. It involves a lot more than CT. It's political, it's military, it's security, it's technology, economy, etc., etc. And then we have two trends: increasing fusion within the national services. And that we've seen for some 20 years. And then you add technology to that with increased use of open source, big data, and fusion. So my perspective is that we're getting increasingly greater problems with sharing, because it's difficult to pull out all of this. So how can we ensure good sharing for CT? That's just one small part of intelligence. So how can we ensure that, both in technology-wise and policy-wise in the future?
I'm going to ask Michael that, because he ran one of the 17 at the time, I think, US intelligence agencies. I mean, I've gone several times to NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center in America, and I'm just staggered at how on earth you coordinate between FBI, CIA, Homeland Security, and all the other NSA and all the other agencies. How do we answer that?
Well, I do think, some of it is you have to create relationships and trust, I think, as Pauline said earlier. And some of it's standardization, having a common language and a common understanding of what the rules are and how you analyze things. And then you simply work together, and that actually creates a greater facility in terms of sharing. And one of the projects, as we mentioned earlier, that GLOBSEC is doing, that we're working on, involves trying to deal with how do we promote information sharing across Europe in a transatlantic way, recognizing that there are varying levels of capability and trust among different countries. And among the things we've talked about are the need to have rules about how you treat information you get from another intelligence agency, having a common understanding of what the standards and the language is, so you're on the same page when you talk about something, and then coming up with opportunities to get people from different services together, including police, not just intelligence. So they learn to create bonds of trust. And I was talking to someone in the intelligence field in Europe 2 days ago who had attended the FBI National Academy. And there they bring in police and intelligence people from all over the world for training. But the best thing that comes out of that is that there is a bond and a relationship that continues well after the course is over, so people can pick up the phone and talk.
I think there's also another context in which the word fusion is important, and as the questioner implied, it's technology, bringing together facial recognition, the analytical capabilities of artificial intelligence. So you do plumb down further. You do find patterns that are relevant, and bringing all your available means together into a single picture. I mean, is increasingly one of the ways in which there is success in this game, because it is getting harder. I think we shouldn't actually underestimate the extent in the terrorist area, where the terrorist learns things not to do, evidence not to give away, and they tend to be much shorter fuse activities these days, with a plot being very quickly hatched rather locally. Doesn't mean to say they don't have collaborators. Much harder to trace because there's no track, there's nothing to pick up beforehand. So all of that means that you have to go further down the road of strengthening your overall picture and bringing your evidence from different sources together.
Right, we've only got time, I'm afraid, for one more question, and the man here with the microphone.
Milo Jones. So far, the discussion has mostly been tactical and mostly been focused on problems of collection. I would like to take a step back and say, usually after an intelligence failure, people say there's been a failure of imagination. And people love that phrase. There's no one to blame, and it's plausible. How confident is the panel that we are hiring the right people to be asking the right questions to prevent the next strategic threat? Or have we lost the muscle, institutional muscles, to even ask big strategic questions and feed them in a timely manner to people who can make a difference and prevent them from being the next 9/11? A friend said to me, we may not be ready for the next 9/11, but we're ready for the next 9/11 commission.
Okay, because we're short of time. That's a very good question. Michael?
I think it is a very good question, and I think there was a concern among people, let's say 10 years after what happened with 9/11, that the intelligence agencies had moved too far in the direction of tactical focus on individual threat streams and actually becoming operational in the field in carrying out quasi-military operations, which ought to be the domain really of the Department of Defense. And I think there's now been some recognition lately that we need to bring the intelligence community back to its original function, which is, first of all, not to carry out military operations or paramilitary operations, and second, to have strategic vision and understanding of adversaries like the Russians and the Chinese and other groups. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see a migration back to that more balanced view, as opposed to a very tactical, like focus on the next threat stream, which was understandable, but robs us of exactly what you're talking about, the ability to see over the horizon.
Right, we are...
I absolutely agree with that.
Good.
We are not nearly strategic enough, and we're not thinking about how these... on that poll, the thing that really interested me was how low a rating cyber got. I'd put cyber much higher. People aren't aware of it because it's still just business, and we part of the Russia threat there is actually quite a lot of it is cyber, and there's no strategic approach, there's no public understanding, there's no sense of government and society together on this, and there are problems inside the system now which we aren't beginning to tackle at all.
And interesting.
But I want to break a lance for the intelligence community here, right? I mean. This question was very much specifically, are the intelligence services strategic enough in their thinking?
And it's not
the
just
strategic
them.
thinking is not necessarily the prime purpose of an intelligence agency.
Exactly.
The strategic thinking is the primary purpose of the political leaders, who then need to tell the intelligence agencies what they need to know in order to counter the strategic threat.
That doesn't mean to say that they shouldn't be strategic, but the strategic lead does have to come from the political leaders.
Okay, apologies for people who've probably still got some excellent questions, but do feel free to try and grab any of the panelists afterwards if you can. Refreshments are available just inside the hotel. If you could be back here for 11 o'clock for the next session, which is on the link between criminality and terrorism, and at the same time upstairs in the Maria Theresia suite, the subject is cybersecurity at 11 o'clock. But in the meantime, would you please show your appreciation for our excellent panel here? And thank you for your questions.